Malcolm Robertson.
Would it be fair to ask what was meant by foreign policy in the early Tudor period?
I think that what was meant by foreign policy in the early Tudor period is what is meant by an attitude to foreigners from the earliest recorded times of human history. Human beings have lived in communities, and one of the factors, one of the elements which all communities are conscious of is a sense of them and us. One might almost say that the solidarity which the people of a community feel for each other is proportional to the sense of hostility which they feel towards them. We find this in other animals, communal animals like the rats, which will be intensely loyal to each other, and yet if an alien rat comes into their midst, it will be torn in pieces. This them-us syndrome gives rise to a need for communal defence. Evidence of this need is to be found if you walk along any chalk downs and come to the Iron Age hill forts. At some time or other, the communal sense became identified with a linguistic group. When that became so for this country, it would be difficult to say, but apparently in the course of the 100 Years' War at least, a sense that we are the English-speaking linguistic group and them are the other people, that seems to have been evident from that time. So Tudor foreign policy was the coherent attempt to defend a self-conscious nation against them.
Granted then that we have the them-us syndrome, but how would you see the dynastic element fitting into this?
A community has to have some sort of coherent direction. Over the centuries, communities have experimented with various types of committee or organisation to provide the direction. One problem which a community has to solve is that of the problem of succession. How is a director of a community, let us say a king, dictator or whatnot, to be succeeded when he comes to the end of his life or the end of his energies? And amongst all the different devices with which communities have experimented, the device of hereditary succession has been, one must say, comparatively successful. It was perhaps the most successful device for the period from approximately AD 1000 to AD 1800. So that the maintenance of the community, the maintenance of us, has to some extent depended upon security of succession, that is, security of the dynasty. Where the dynasty has not been secure, the community has tended to disintegrate and defence against them has collapsed.
How far do you feel that Henry VII understood the importance of dynastic continuity?
I think he was vividly aware of the importance of dynastic continuity. He himself had observed Edward IV, a very able ruler who served his country pretty well in the way of providing better security, failed in one respect. He did not provide a secure succession. There was a time when Edward IV had an evident successor in his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, but instead of resting content with that, he somewhat irresponsibly, one might say, from a political point of view, Edward somewhat irresponsibly married late in life, so late that having regard to men's expectation of life at that time, he was almost certain to leave behind him children. As we know, there naturally arose a conflict between rival guardians of Edward V and his brother, his maternal uncles on the one side, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, on the other, and the civil conflict to which this gave rise made it easy for this community to be invaded. Indeed, Henry VII, then Henry, Duke of Richmond, found that he could enter the country very easily indeed in 1485. So there's no doubt that Henry VII was vividly aware of the importance of providing for dynastic security, a secure dynastic succession, and once he was king, his energies were very largely expended in making sure that his own son and heir, first Arthur, then Henry, would follow in his footsteps with reasonable security.
Could Henry VII, when he died, have any real right to feel successful?
Yes, I think that in the last few months before he died, he must have felt a very considerable sense, perhaps a profound sense of gratitude that in the end he had been successful. Though only 2 or 3 years before he died, it looked as though he was going to suffer remarkable failure. And this was because he tried to use the power of Spain, and in particular the power of Castile, to secure the succession to his own throne to his son Henry. He had betrothed her to Catherine of Aragon in order that the power of Castile would see to it that Prince Henry became King of England without let or hindrance. The death of Isabel of Castile meant to say that Ferdinand of Aragon ceased to control the power of Castile. The power of Castile fell to Philip of the Netherlands, who was at that time husband of Joanna, a daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. So that the shift of the power of Castile from Ferdinand to a Netherlander seemed likely to deprive Henry VII's arrangements of the power which they required. However, as we all know, Philip of the Netherlands died. Joanna's insanity became quite evident. Ferdinand of Aragon was able to assert authority over his widow's territory of Castile, and the arrangements which Henry VII had laboriously constructed back in 1503 recover their existence in 1509, and so Prince Henry did in fact become Henry VIII without any resistance from any party.
And so then Henry VIII, primarily due to his father's efforts, was able to succeed to the throne smoothly and peacefully. But did he really understand his father's dynastic anxieties?
I think he did. If he didn't understand those anxieties at the very beginning of his reign, he grew to understand them very, very quickly, more especially when Catherine of Aragon failed to give him a son and heir. As we all know, only of her many children, only one daughter, Mary Tudor, survived, and Mary Tudor was regarded as an uncertain heir to Henry VIII. Henry VIII, one might say, became positively obsessed with the dynastic problem, the problem of providing a secure succession, certainly from 1521. This was the reason why Henry VIII jockeyed Wolsey out of Wolsey's own chosen foreign policy, which was a policy of making an equal alliance with France and Spain. Henry VIII insisted in 1521 on a single alliance between England and Spain. It was part of the alliance that Charles V should be betrothed to Princess Mary, and in this way Spain was to secure the succession of Mary Tudor to the throne, just as Ferdinand had been assigned the part of securing Henry VIII's succession to his father. Again, when Charles V repudiated this alliance with England in 1525-6, betrothed himself to a Portuguese princess, and married her, this repudiation of Mary Tudor by Charles V destroyed Henry VIII's foreign policy, opened up a need for building a secure succession from the very beginning once more. He immediately declared legitimate his illegitimate son, the Duke of Richmond, hoping perhaps to build him up into a possible heir. This action, of course, was very distressing to Catherine of Aragon, to see an illegitimate child brought in ahead of her own legitimate child, and from that time onwards she was not on speaking terms with Henry VIII. The Duke of Richmond, however, was an ailing child. He, in fact, developed tuberculosis quite early on in life, and so the whole question of having his marriage with Catherine of Aragon declared null, having Henry VIII himself declared to be a bachelor so he could marry somebody else and secure an undoubted heir, arose from Charles V's repudiation of the English alliance and Mary Tudor in 1525-26.
So if we accept then that Henry VIII did understand the dynastic problem, did he have any other ambitions or objectives which his father had not?
Yes, I'm speaking now of the early years of his reign. I think that he was brought up in the heroic tradition of Edward III and Henry V. He was, in some senses, a late medieval, quasi-chivalric ruler who saw Rome and Paris as the capitals of Europe, and saw it as part of the accepted role of a monarch to joust in the battlefields of Europe. This wasn't a hard-headed foreign policy, but it expressed Henry's hunch that a monarch must fulfill the expectations of his people, that they at that time expected their monarch to fulfill a chivalric role, to play the part perhaps of a crusader, and that by so doing he was in a way strengthening his own hold on the throne and the probability of his successors following him.
You said that in 1521 Henry elbowed Wolsey away from his conception of foreign policy, that of an equal alliance with France and Spain, and that he wanted to put in its place an alliance exclusively with Spain. And would you care to elaborate on Wolsey?
The most interesting group of men in the first half of the 16th century, I would say, are those who are known collectively as the international religious humanists. Men like Erasmus, More, Contarini, and Wolsey, I think, as an Oxford academic, accepted their view of the possibilities of human improvement. I think they believed that if the wisdom of ancient Greece could be allowed to illuminate and play upon the traditional Christian inspiration, and that both of these could illuminate and be illuminated by the best critical thinking of contemporaries, that Europe would enjoy not only a splendid cultural revival, including a profound religious revival, but Europe would enjoy a political development which would be to the future glory of God and man. And part of this political development they specifically saw in the field of international relationships. Wolsey, as I say, had caught something of the thought of these men, and in his great treaty of 1518, ostensibly this was a treaty between England, France and Spain, not only were past disagreements settled, but there was an agreement applying to the future that each of these countries would rally to any country which was the victim of aggression and sustain it. This is an early form of collective security. Moreover, the Treaty of 1518 was not kept exclusive to England, France and Spain, but was opened to signatures from other states of Europe, and some 20 became signatories. The subsequent meetings of Henry VIII or Wolsey with Francis I at the Field of the Cloth of Gold and with Charles V were not ad hoc meetings, but were the beginnings or were an attempt towards the establishment of systematic meetings between monarchs, which it was hoped would usher in a new age in international affairs. This is the policy from which Wolsey was jockeyed, as I say, by Henry VIII's dynastic obsessions in 1521.
You mentioned the breach with Rome when talking of the dynastic issue. Were there any other elements in the breach with Rome other than Henry's wish to become a bachelor, with the prime objective of producing a male heir?
That motive was the first motive in time, but with the passage of time it was superseded by another motive which became the dominant one. The other motive is expressed with the use of such words as empire or sovereignty. The word empire was used of England. England has been an empire from time out of mind. The word empire was used of England frequently in the first quarter of this century, but the meaning ascribed to it changed. Initially it was an assertion that the rulers of England were not subject to any external potentate like the Holy Roman Emperor. It was taken for granted that the Pope was supreme in matters spiritual. The monarch of England, the King of England, was asserting simply his autonomy in matters secular. But Henry VIII's experience in his dealings with the Pope in the course of endeavouring to secure the annulment of his marriage made him realize, or at any rate made him believe, that the distinction between things secular and things spiritual was not a real one. He came to believe that he who asserted sovereignty over all his subjects without exception, be they laymen or clergy, as he did, was in effect asserting authority not only over all his subjects without exception, but in all respects without exception. And looking back to the distant past, he saw himself as claiming the powers, claiming to be the heir to the Emperor Constantine. He claimed sovereignty. I think one can date this claim, the formulation of this claim in a clear form from the autumn of 1530. And thereafter, although Henry VIII still hoped that the Pope would declare his marriage with Catherine now, I think that even if the Pope had done so, Henry VIII would still have insisted on sovereignty in this sense and would have accorded to the Pope no more than a limited concordat, giving him a certain influence in this country.
In the aftermath of the breach with Rome, was there any conflict in foreign policy between Henry VIII and Cromwell?
There was no conflict between them in aim. They both recognized that having broken away from Rome, England might be subject to a joint crusade from France and Spain in the name of Roman Catholicism. But while they both recognized this danger and the need to take steps to repel it, for example, they were agreed in the construction of a navy, they were agreed in the construction of fortifications along the south coast of England, many of which can still be seen, for example, Hurst Castle. Nevertheless, they had a different estimate of the magnitude of the danger, and I think the difference sprang from their own differences of, let us say, religious temperament. I think that Cromwell was a sincere Protestant, a sincere man of religious principle, and was inclined to ascribe to others the motives which he felt in himself. He was inclined to say, if I were Francis, if I were Charles V, I should sacrifice the political interests of my country for the sake of a religious Roman Catholic crusade to restore England to Roman Catholicism. Henry VIII was, I think, perhaps more easygoing, intellectually easygoing. He was disposed to sacrifice religious principle to political interest and assumed that others would do likewise. That being the case, he could not believe that Charles V and Francis I would ever sink their political differences and launch a joint attack upon England. This conflict, this differing estimate between Cromwell and Henry VIII was one of the causes of friction between them, which contributed to the ultimate fall of Cromwell.
In comparing Henry and Cromwell, you say that Henry was intellectually easygoing. Would you take this as far as saying that once Cromwell had fallen, Henry had no foreign policy?
I wouldn't take it as far as that. I think that an alternative foreign policy was growing up in the 30s, which Henry VIII adopted in the 1540s. And this is the foreign policy of Greater Britain, the policy, that is, of substantially turning one's back on Europe and using the national energies to bring about a political unification of England, Wales, Ireland and Scotland. Administrative steps in this direction had been taken in respect of Wales in the 30s, and certain military and administrative steps likewise in Ireland in the 30s. In regard to Scotland, the question of the unification of the British Isles was interlocked with the question of succession, with the dynastic question. For by 1540, the probable heir to the English throne was James V of Scotland. The only person standing between Henry VIII and James V was the somewhat feeble Prince Edward. So we find that from 1540-41 onwards, Henry VIII was setting himself to establish some sort of reconciliation with James of Scotland. From Henry VIII's point of view, the only disadvantage in James V of Scotland becoming King of England was that James V of Scotland was a client of France. So there was a prospect, and to Henry VIII a hideous prospect, of England becoming a client of Scotland, which was in turn a client of France. Henry VIII wished to do a deal with James V, whereby Henry VIII would guarantee to James V the English succession after Prince Edward, and James V would cut his connections with France. Of course, it was first of all the refusal of James V to break his connections with France, and then the death of James V, which led Henry VIII to adopt a continuation of this policy, namely to bring about a betrothal of James V's daughter, Mary Queen of Scots, with his own son, Prince Edward, so that perhaps in the person of the offspring of Edward and Mary Queen of Scots, England and Scotland would be unified. Alternatively, if Edward died and Mary Queen of Scots became Queen of England and Scotland, then England and Scotland would be united. But again, the whole thing from Henry VIII's point of view must depend upon Scotland severing its connections with France. And when Scotland refused to do that, Henry VIII put in his third act of succession, which restored Elizabeth and Mary Tudor to legitimacy, brought them into the succession in order to endeavour to exclude Scotland, and that is France. The policy of bringing about a unification of England and Scotland by a marriage of Edward and Mary Queen of Scots, of course, was the policy of the Protector Somerset, a mere continuation of Henry VIII's policy, which collapsed at Somerset's death.
So Henry could well have achieved, had James V lived, the union which came about at the end of Elizabeth's reign.
Precisely.
Malcolm Robertson and Paul Crowson, thank you.
Try as one may when studying Mary's reign, one seems to look in vain for an analysis of Marian foreign policy. Would you feel that this total omission is justifiable?
Yes, I think it is. I think, strictly speaking, neither Northumberland nor Mary had a foreign policy. They were rather like Charles II. In a sense, he had a foreign policy. He had a secret treaty of Dover with Louis XIV. But his foreign policy, from his point of view, was so totally subordinate to his ambitions, his constitutional ambitions, and his hope to turn England Roman Catholic, that it was not so much a foreign policy in itself as the sacrifice of foreign policy to religious ambitions. In the same way, I think one can say that Northumberland desired above all to shift the succession to the throne from the Tudors to the Dudleys for the sake of family ambition, and that his friendliness with Henry II of France was designed purely to achieve that. That Mary desired to shift the succession from Elizabeth to Philip for the sake of Roman Catholicism, and her alliance with Spain had that in mind rather than any notion of foreign policy proper.
Yes, that's all very well, but surely if Northumberland and Mary had no foreign policy, the country itself had at least certain aspirations. Can one in any way recognise what one could perhaps call community foreign policy?
Yes, I think that is so. I think that, again, to take the analogy of Charles II, at a time when the monarch and the men about him that constituted the government can be said to have had no foreign policy, the community as represented in Parliament clearly had one, and demanded cessation of war in 1673-74, the cessation of war against the Dutch, the end of the alliance with France. They pressed for, and one might say secured, the marriage of William of Orange to Mary, daughter of the Duke of York. The community can have aspirations in foreign policy which are not being expressed by the government's policy. And in the same way, I think that the community in the days of Northumberland and the days of Mary Tudor had aspirations, had a desire to perhaps turn their backs somewhat on Europe, to use their energies such as they were to secure a unification of the British Isles, to push their energies out into the New World. And it is said that people ceased to go to Mass when they heard of the loss of Calais. This statement, I think, does express the fact that the community can have the makings of foreign policy in its feelings, even at a time when the government is not expressing those feelings at all.
Surely this is something that Elizabeth realised. Wasn't she one amongst the Tudors who recognised that foreign policy and community aspirations must work together?
I think she recognised that extremely powerfully. I think she was not alone amongst the Tudors in so recognising. Indeed, I think she followed very much in the spirit of her father. I think Henry VIII recognised this also. But she did recognise it, and it is most important, especially for a comparatively small country, that there should be a unison between the policy adopted by our government and the aspirations of the community. There were times when, for a short period, a government could adopt a policy which was alien to the aspirations of the community, perhaps. For a short time, for example, Northumberland could raise the money to hire European mercenaries to suppress Cat's rebellion. But that is not a thing which any Tudor government could do for many years on end. Now, Elizabeth was involved in actual warfare for the last 25 years of her reign, and spasmodic warfare for many other years. Had she depended, as the early Tudors did, for example, on loans from Antwerp, well, the loans would have dried up, and she would not have been able to sustain that war effort. She was only able to sustain the war effort because the community was substantially with her, and her parliaments, for all their reluctance to bear taxation, voted an unprecedented number of subsidies, particularly in the 1590s. She had many quarrels with her parliaments, but not, I think, over the matter of taxation. Again, a prolonged war effort of this nature requires a very substantial administrative effort. The effort was provided by the justices of the peace, unpaid men up and down the country. Moreover, much of the actual fighting was private enterprise warfare. The first intervention in the Netherlands was by Thomas Morgan and 300 volunteers who just by, I think, a few weeks managed to prevent the Spaniards occupying Flushing in 1572, and for most of the next 30 years the fighting in the Netherlands was largely sustained by volunteers, private enterprise warfare, and this of course also goes for the warfare at sea. A prime example of this being Drake's expedition of 1587, which established itself on the southwestern coast of Portugal for a month or 6 weeks, and from that base raided the shipping which was converging on Lisbon from the Mediterranean, from India and America. This was a private syndicate, private enterprise warfare, and without this support, it's difficult to see how the government's foreign policy could possibly have been sustained.
Now, this is a very broad question, but I think a very necessary question. Could you isolate the prime objectives of Elizabeth's foreign policy?
The prime objective of Elizabeth's foreign policy was to preserve the independence of this country from either a French empire or a Spanish empire, to defend us from them. This defence was primarily naval. Naval defence involved the occupation of the ports from which the invading fleet might come. In other words, the defence of England involved the preservation in the hands of at least neutrals of the ports along the north coast of France, to preserve those ports, for example, in the hands of Huguenots. Even more important was to preserve in the hands of friends or neutrals any deep water ports to the east of the Straits of Dover. This is because the eastern coast of England is the most vulnerable. It is lowland. London is on the east. Any easterly wind which will blow an invading fleet from, say, Flushing or Brill will blow the defending fleet, the English defending fleet, back into its harbours. The naval defence of England from any port east of the Straits of Dover was very difficult indeed. For that reason, the key to the defence of England was to defend the ports of the Low Countries of the Netherlands, so that they never fell into the hands of Spain, if Spain was the threat, or of France, if France was the threat. Second to that, to control the ports of northern France.
Elizabeth's foreign policy is often seen almost exclusively in terms of conflict with Spain. Now, surely this is not justified.
No, it isn't. It is not justified. First of all, it is not justified during the first 10 years of her reign, in which her foreign policy was almost exclusively concerned with France, with ejecting France from the position which France had established, the army of occupation which France had established in Scotland. Spain only became the menace to the defence of this country when the Duke of Alva took a Spanish army to the Netherlands in 1568. From that time onwards, the immediate aim of Elizabeth's foreign policy was to induce the Spaniards to withdraw from the Netherlands, not to withdraw their political presence from the Netherlands, but to withdraw their military presence from the Netherlands. But throughout the 25, 30 years during which Elizabeth was involved in bringing about, or endeavouring to bring about, the withdrawal of Spanish troops from the Netherlands, she never forgot that if it was dangerous for the Spaniards to be in military occupation of the Netherlands, it was more dangerous for France to be. She never forgot that France would in due course recover from the Huguenot Wars and be a greater threat than Spain. Therefore, the object of Elizabeth's foreign policy was to persuade the Spaniards to withdraw their army from the Netherlands, but to retain a suzerainty over the Netherlands, so that if a time should come when France invaded the Netherlands, Spain would come to the defence of the Netherlands by sending an invading army across the Pyrenees.
So Elizabeth became involved with Spain primarily for strategic reasons of the Netherlands. Would you see any religious motivation behind what was the growing animosity now between Britain and Spain?
I should say that there was virtually no religious motivation on the side of Elizabeth. As I've said already, her aim was to leave Spain with a certain authority, a certain suzerainty over the Netherlands. She recognised that the southern provinces of the Netherlands were Roman Catholic. She was reconciled to a continuation of that. She was reconciled to a continuation of Spanish suzerainty over the Netherlands. She was not fighting to make the Netherlands safe for any form of Protestantism. The only slight religious element in Elizabeth's own point of view arose from the fact that the Roman Catholic faithful were required by the papal standpoint to regard Elizabeth as illegitimate and as not rightfully Queen of England. There was that slight personal element in it, but I think it would be substantially true to say that from Elizabeth's point of view, there was not a religious element in her foreign policy. One can't, I think, be quite so decisive if one is asking about the point of view of Philip II. I would guess that by the middle of the 1580s, Philip II was looking towards the establishment of a Roman Catholic Christendom across a large part of Europe, Spain, Italy, the Central Rhinelands, England, Ireland, Scotland. This political Christendom was neither an exclusively political concept nor an exclusively religious concept. In a sense, it was an imperial concept, but an imperial concept to which one might apply the word holy, like Holy Roman Empire. Since religion and politics are so fused into one, it is meaningless to say that an action is either religious or political. The two are one.
In the light of what you said, however, what's your reaction to Professor Elton's comment that Elizabeth was doomed to lead a war of religion?
I don't think she did. Of course, some of the people that she was leading were religious, were fighting for their religion, as Walsingham struggled for his religion as a diplomat. One wouldn't say that the Duke of Wellington led a war of loot because some of his troops were looters.
How far would you say that Elizabeth's own character was reflected in her foreign policy? Was there a personal flavour?
In one sense, I would say not. The point of the foreign policy was that the foreign policy expressed the aspirations of the community, that the Queen was at one with her people, and her foreign policy, though it was her foreign policy, was also theirs. Nevertheless, there are two respects in which I think the personal element was important. The first is that Elizabeth was by no means tongue-tied. She had a great command of language and gesture, and by making the right remark or the right gesture, she reinforced men's sense of what their aims were, what their efforts were about. And this reinforcement gave, as it always does, gave a degree of energy and effectiveness to their achievements. Perhaps, as a telling example of her command of gesture, one might mention her journey, her condescension in going down out of the City of London into Dockland, into Deptford, in order to knight Drake on the deck of his own ship. This action was full of deep significance, not only for English people, but, in all that it said, for the government of Spain. The second respect in which I think there was a personal element in Elizabethan foreign policy derived this element not from Elizabeth, but from William Cecil, Lord Burleigh. The strategy which was necessary to carry Elizabethan foreign policy into action was many-sided. Effort was made in many directions simultaneously. Troops in the Netherlands, shipping in Plymouth, shipping in the Caribbean, troops in Ireland, possibly these things happening simultaneously. This complex expenditure of effort on the part of a small country of only 3 million people could easily have become uncoordinated. Efforts in one part of the world could have conflicted with or undermined the effect of efforts in another. But in a remarkable way, the Elizabethan effort towards her enemies, towards the enemies of this country, was coordinated. And I think that this coordination derived from the capacity of Lord Burleigh to keep every element in this complex strategy under continuous observation and to some extent under continuous coordinating control.
You've discussed the various personal motives, the religious motives, the dynastic motives of the Tudor monarchs. Would you like to draw up a balance sheet or a profit and loss account of the Tudors and foreign policy?
The profitability to this country of Tudor foreign policy can, I think, be measured if we think about Naples in the 17th century, or the southern Netherlands, or perhaps Brittany, particularly Naples and the southern Netherlands, countries which had been the very forefront of Renaissance activity in the 15th century, were oppressed, parochial backwaters of 17th and 18th century Europe. The successful defence of England by the Tudors saved England from becoming a province of Spain, as did Naples in the southern Netherlands, or a province of France, as did Brittany. That defence is, of course, a negative achievement. Having their independence, a people can make a good or bad use of it. In the case of England, their independence was used to follow neither the Counter-Reformation nor the Calvinist Reformation, but to become a strange oasis of, let us say, religious humanism. The intellectual leaders of England, whether they were bishops or laymen, were men whose education was based upon the Bible and the classics and the development of their own critical intellects, and the interplay, the illuminating interplay of these three forces. The language of the country, the language of the authorized version of the Bible, combined the dignity of the classics with the simplicity of the vernacular. The architecture, the stately homes, again, combined a certain classical dignity with a domestic simplicity. This was the spirit which developed on the basis of the Tudor defence of the independence of this country. The economic life of the country was able to develop without the oppressive taxation suffered by the Neapolitans and the southern Netherlanders, and enjoying scope to settle in any parts of the world which were not in effective occupation by Spain and Portugal, notwithstanding anything that the Pope may have laid down in 1495. On that basis, we were able to develop a mercantile marine which developed such trade and discovered such markets that as leads us on towards the agrarian and industrial revolutions of the 18th century.
And finally, what would you see as the legacy of Tudor foreign policy?
The legacy of the Tudors to the Stuarts was a position of such comparative strength that for 15 years no foreign policy was needed. No European country was in a position to invade us. After 15 years, there followed another 30 years during which the powers of Europe expended their energies in the 30 Years' War. Consequently, the Stuarts were able to commit the forces of this country to a civil war in which no European power took upon itself to intervene. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the Tudors to the Stuarts was that the population of Stuart England was allowed to fight a civil war without any European country intervening.
Paul Crowson and Malcolm Robertson, thank you.